Jake woke up quivering. He knew he was still feverish, but trembled as though chilled through to the back of his bones. Boiling spasms made him twitch. There was a rolling wave of pins and needles that swam down from his neck to his knees. And every time he closed his eyes, he felt a rippling tremor run through him, a kind of internal dizziness where all the blackness of his closed eyes swam around him like a whirlpool. His throat was sore. Every time he swallowed, it was like having to break through a crusted scab. And his head was full of catarrh. There were 2 drops of the stuff that felt like hammocks of warm green custard waiting to fall into the back of his mouth whenever he let his head fall back. He tried shifting his position in his own hammock, but its swinging motion just made him feel worse. And he couldn't find anywhere comfortable for his head. He was ill, all right, and he had been delirious for days, possibly longer, with terrifying shudders and inconsolable wailings. Shaking, quaking, Jake the Shaker, quaking Jake. Actually, as nicknames go, that wasn't bad, he thought. Every pirate needs a nickname, and he had joined the ship with the intention of becoming a great pirate. His hero was Calico Jack. Largely because of the nickname, that little almost rhyme made it even more memorable. Around his hometown of Titchbury, everyone said Calico Jack was a Devon man. No one actually knew, of course. But along that rocky coastline where everyone was a smuggler or knew smugglers, Calico Jack was seen as one of theirs. Even though Jake's father was just a fisherman by trade, he knew every legend of pirates and pirating, from battle tactics to the legendary raiders and the thrilling dangers that attended robbery on the high seas, all that history. He knew about the lonely madness that overtook those set ashore on deserted islands, and the wild insanity of stranded sailors in the vast windless areas of the equator. He knew about trade routes and silver cargoes, dastardly rapscallions and men of honour, luckless voyages and creaking ghost ships. Jake's father always claimed he wanted to be a pirate, but his family, his fishing income and his basic cowardice meant he stayed at home. He still helps the smugglers though. No one could navigate those desperate rocky outlets and inlets, nor work their way through the woods to the tiny hidden farmhouses without help. And the locals were happy to assist. Any ship with valuable cargo, alcohol, silver, gold, spices, tobacco, indeed almost anything that might get taxed by the government would be robbed by the pirates, who would then sneak their booty ashore and give a generous payment to anyone who might store it before they sold it secretly on the black market. An old fisherman's cottage was too small for much storage space, but Jake's father had a few pigs and cattle, and if you didn't know where to look in the dung-filled yard, you wouldn't think he could keep anything there either. But lurking under the foulest smelling pile of sewage, which no sane man would even go near, was a little trap door. And under that, if you could bear getting covered in dripping animal excrement, was a cellar big enough for 50 barrels. Jake learned his father's trade quickly, and as quickly realised it wasn't for him. Nor was sneaking around a filthy cellar for a bit of extra money his idea of life. Jake wanted excitement, swords, wild fights with Spanish merchantmen, treasure, freedom and nothing to fear. As soon as his father realised that Jake really was set on piracy, and not the navy or fishing or just a bit of smuggling, he spent months trying to scare him with stories of shipwrecks, abandonment, poverty and mutilation. He took special trouble to tell stories of young cabin boys being eaten by starving sailors who were stuck miles from land with no wind to help them or any way to navigate. And he constantly spoke of horrible deaths at sea and spectral ships endlessly being blown across the oceans, while pirate skeletons grinned perpetually on deck, wandering the empty seas aboard creaking, rag-sailed hulks in a ceaseless quest for peace. Jake had listened with gleeful horror, but one night when Captain Flanders had been at the cottage paying for the storage of some more illegal plunder, Jake had stolen a moment alone with him. "Can I come with you, sir?" Captain Flanders had looked at him quickly, then cautiously around the room to see if anyone else was there. "Yes," he said calmly and unexpressively. He was from Devon but seemed to have no accent at all. His voice was always calm and unassertive. Maybe that's why Jake trusted him. "But I warn you only once. It is fearful work, and money comes briefly, if at all. We do not play at this, and our world is one of darkness and death. I myself have done things I would shame to tell another. If you have the stomach for it, we will welcome brave new blood. But you must be sure, young Jake. If you will come, be at the gully by the tip of Heartland Point at 3 this coming morning. We will not wait." So Jake went, having stolen a bottle of brandy and 2 shillings from his father's cabinet. He left a short note. His father had always believed in the value of an education, though not with this in mind. And Jake slipped away easily, getting to the gully an hour early with such waves of thrilled excitement running through him that he thought he must be positively glowing. Jake gave Captain Flanders the bottle when he got on board and also presented him with the shillings. Captain Flanders laughed but seemed grateful, and seeing a small crack in the wooden housing of the compass, he slid the shillings in until they stuck. Then saying in his still, calm way, "No need to pay for your passage, but I tell you what, as soon as you want to leave the ship, you just take these and away you go. But I think you'll be staying." Jake was introduced to Morgan the quartermaster, Job the boatswain, and Sharry the cook and surgeon. They may not have welcomed him like a brother, but they didn't throw him overboard when the captain's back was turned, which was what Jake had feared. Jake happily took on his appointed duties, despite the fact they were often filthy, seemed to go on forever, and left him aching all over. But he was in a swirl of innocent joy. When the tide turned and the ship weighed anchor, the sky was blue, the wind was fresh, and the squawk of the gulls began to fade away as the Stillness set out towards the wide, deep oceans. 3 months later, Jack was licking his cracked and bleeding lips under a sun that seemed to turn the air into a hot, sticky liquid, and the sea into nothing more than a sheen of bluey white. There were no birds squawking, no waves bouncing off the bow, no spray lifting into his face like fountains. There was no wind. It was so completely airless that simply breathing seemed almost a risk, and talking was just a dangerous waste of oxygen. Everyone was in a state of constant breathlessness, as if waiting to exhale but never able to. It seemed wrong somehow to even try and disturb the eerie stillness. Whatever they breathed in had a stale, infected feel to it, like sniffing rotten meat or a bag full of old vegetables. The ship was some hundreds of miles to the west of Africa, unmoving, incapable of movement, and now beyond any hope of it. For 2 weeks the Celestina had been essentially stationary, as if set in a flat, shimmering glass plate. Even with all the sails up, which they were always in the desperate hope of catching the slightest breeze, they threw no shadow in the hottest part of the day, when the sun sat straight above them in the sky and crushed their spirits while it roasted the bodies of anyone foolish enough to go on deck. Most did not, but things were not much better below. The limited and quickly rotting pickled food and tiny rations of water were adding to the growing number of illnesses on board, and fresh food was as scarce as a stiff breeze. If there were any fish in the water, they had swum as far away from the lifeless surface as they could. No one had any appetite anyway. They glanced up through the hatches at the blistering sky and then sank down again into the putrid shade. It was no surprise that illness came, nor that the sailors, starved of a decent diet for weeks, should succumb so quickly. It was just unfortunate that Jake, despite being the fittest and the youngest on board, should also go down with it, and seriously. Everyone was shocked at how deeply fevered he became, and they all saw it as a bad omen that he should start raving about all the terrors his father had warned him of. "Keep him away from me," he said whenever Sharry the cook got anywhere near him. "He's going to eat me, keep him away." Cooks on board ships were often insulted about their meals, though rarely because someone thought he was going to be the main ingredient. Sharry wasn't offended, but since he was the doctor as well, it was difficult for him to keep his distance completely. Anyway, as he said, there was precious little he could do apart from make sure that Jake got his ration of water. But Jake would get through it, he was sure of that. It was the others he was worried about. Jake woke up quivering. He knew he was still feverish, but something told him there had been a change. Was his hammock swinging slightly? Was the ship, it seemed almost inconceivable, moving? And what was that noise above his head? The sound of people doing things? Jake slowly moved his head away from the blackness of the corner into which he had been facing, and slowly, dizzily began to slide out of his hammock. The area below decks in which he had been placed was at the lowest and farthest stern of any of the living quarters, and the darkness was so complete he had no idea if it was day or night. What was more, he couldn't tell if he was swaying because he was so weak after his fever or because he was on a moving ship. Had he lost his sea legs in the everlasting stillness? Or had he found them again by swinging in a hammock for however long it had been? Everything was unclear. Jake felt as though he was floating through the tenebrous underworld of the ship, feeling his way along the gangplank that ran down the central aisle by instinct alone, while he tried to stay upright, and while he tried at the same time to control the thrilling possibility of being out of that pestilential tranquility. He moved towards the nearest hatchway and peered up. There were tiny chinks of light peeping through the layers of decking above, but they were too vague to tell him anything. He reached up to find a grab rope to guide himself onto the ladder. It was so dark he couldn't see his own hand, but it felt as weak as his legs had done just a few minutes earlier. He could actually hear his bones creaking as they grasped the rope. Hauling himself up, he could feel his legs aching and creaking too, but any pain was overwhelmed by the fact he was more and more certain that the ship was moving, and they had found a way out of that awful immobility. He could hear some voices now. He was sure of it. Feet clumping on the boards a couple of decks above him. Everyone must be on the upper deck. He hauled himself up another set of steps, feeling weaker and weaker, but at the same time strengthened by his growing hope. The light didn't seem to be getting any brighter, though. The little glimpses that he caught were no stronger. Could it be moonlight? Even better. A wind to take them forward, the moon and stars to guide them, and no blinding sun to make them feel unbearably hot. He reached the deck hatch and climbed into the outside air for the first time in what felt like ages. There was a lot of activity. Jake had climbed up the stern hatchway, which meant everyone was facing away from him and towards the bow as they went about their tasks. But he could see Captain Flanders standing by the helmsman at the wheel. He could see Job looking up at the mainmast to the various crewmen in the rigging. And he could see Morgan deciding which sails to set to catch the wind. And the sails were filled beautifully, their curves and billows gracefully straining against the masts and spars. But something was wrong. Jake had lifted his head towards the sky and closed his eyes as he got to the deck just for the sheer pleasure of feeling the wind in his face. But there was no wind, nothing. The air was as still as the immobility they had left behind. So what was filling the sails? Jake opened his eyes quickly and looked up. The sky was as black as night, and the light from it was not moonlight. There was no stars. There was a brilliant orb in the sky, but Jake knew well enough that it was not the moon. It was the sun, yet it was illuminating everything, not with brightness, but with a pale whiteness. Jake felt his stomach lurch in fear, and he coughed. At the noise, Captain Flanders, who was closest to him, turned around and said, "Jake, welcome back. We thought we lost you. Now, I warned you that what we did was a dark business, didn't I?" But Jake could not hear him. He had turned away in terror, for the face of Captain Flanders, the trusted captain, an inspiration for his leaving home, was not the calm, still and sea-worn face he had come to respect, even love, but that of a raddled skeleton. The gently inexpressive voice came from a mouth with no flesh or lips, but only wildly grinning teeth and sockets for eyes. The captain called out with a strangely cruel set to his face, "Job, come here." Jake watched in hypnotized fear as the figure of Job turned from his post and walked towards the captain. In the baffling light, with the sails impossibly spread behind him, Job swaggered over, and although he walked and seemed to see where he was going, he too was a skeleton. His hands were clicking bones at the end of his sleeves, his face a ghastly yellow-white skull. In the open-necked area of his shirt, Jake could see the precarious balance of his vertebrae and the solid line of his breastbone. He nearly fainted at the sight, but the captain's next words kept him from it. "Job, get Sherry here. The cabin boy has recovered, and I think the crew will eat well tonight." Job smiled, though how could Jake tell that he was smiling when he didn't have any lips? Jake started to look around him for something to end this nightmare. He was a prisoner on board a ghost ship filled with bloodthirsty spirits, and he had to get away as fast as he could. There were no boats he could get into, and there was no point in running up the rigging or hiding down below. He looked over the side of the ship and stopped, startled by what he saw, or rather didn't see. There was nothing there. No evidence of movement, no reflections of the light, no sense even of water. Black stillness. Were they floating? What world was this? Jake looked around him, panicking, and he saw Sherry approaching with a knife 8 inches long. The knife was curved and tapering to a murderous point. Sherry was laughing, his hollow, skeletal mouth suddenly opening up like the secret caves near Heartland Point, near Jake's home, near his father. Surely there was a way to get back, to return, unhurt and repentant, to become a fisherman, even to help with that stinking trapdoor, anything if it meant getting away from these mad skeletons who were determined to kill him. Jake climbed up onto the edge of the ship and prepared to jump. "Jake," called Captain Flanders, "don't trouble yourself with that. There's no point for one thing, and for another, we're only playing with ya. No one's gonna be eating you for dinner or anything else." Jake looked at the hideous apparitions in front of him. He tried to breathe more steadily. He glanced down at the endless black beneath the ship, and then along the deck to the various crewmen who had all stopped their work to see what was going on. All were just white bones beneath their sailors' clothes. This grotesque party were surely nothing more than creatures of his fevered imagination. If he stopped panicking, he would wake up and find himself recovered, or perhaps still ill, but not in danger of a ghostly sacrifice. Jake climbed down from the edge of the swaying boat. Just behind the captain, he could see 2 small silver glints on the mounting of the compass. His shillings. "That's right," said Captain Flanders. "Come down. Sharry's got no plans for a cabin boy stew. After all, look at you, there's no meat on you." And the captain began to laugh, and Sharry began to laugh, and Job began to laugh, and all the crewmen joined in laughing too. Enough. Jake moved past the captain towards the compass and the 2 shillings. He was desperate to retrieve them. These were his means of escape. These shillings would break the dream and take him home to the cottage in Titchbury. But as he reached the mounting and stretched out to clasp them back, Jake saw his hand and saw that his fingers were no more than clicking bones thrust from his tattered sleeve. The pirate's laughter echoed in the creamy black stillness and drowned out the scream of the howling cabin boy.